A homeless veteran unlocked his grandmother's cabin that had been sealed for 25 years. But when his German shepherd began digging under the floor, he uncovered a secret that would change everything. Ethan Brooks had lost nearly everything: his home, his job, and almost his hope. With only his loyal German shepherd, Ranger, at his side, he followed a worn map his grandmother left behind into the frozen Bitterroot Mountains. The cabin had been locked for decades, hidden deep in the forest. But the moment Ethan opened the door, Ranger sensed something strange beneath the floor. Something that had remained untouched for 25 years. Before the story begins, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? The fluorescent lights above the truck stop hummed with a tired electric buzz that never seemed to stop. They washed everything in a pale, artificial glow that made the long Montana highway outside feel even lonelier. Snow drifted across the dark parking lot in thin sheets as the wind pushed it along the asphalt. Ethan Brooks sat on a plastic bench near the vending machines, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together like he was trying to hold himself together. His beard had grown uneven over the past few weeks, and the cuffs of his old green army jacket had begun to fray. The clock above the cashier counter read 2:14 in the morning. He hadn't slept, not really, not for more than a few minutes at a time. Every time his eyes closed, something snapped inside his mind. A memory, a sound, a flash of desert sunlight exploding into fire. Then he'd wake up again, heart racing, breath short. For a moment he would forget where he was. For a moment he would expect to hear the shouting of soldiers or the deep thud of helicopters overhead. Instead, there was only the quiet hum of the truck stop and the distant rumble of diesel engines out on the highway. Ethan rubbed his hands together, trying to push warmth back into his fingers. Montana winters had a way of creeping into your bones. At his feet, a large German shepherd lifted his head. The dog's name was Ranger. Even after everything, after the miles of walking, after the nights spent outside, after the weeks without a proper home, Ranger still kept watch. The dog's ears twitched at every movement in the room. A trucker walked past carrying a coffee. Ranger's eyes followed him, calmly protective, always alert. Ethan reached down and rested a hand on the dog's thick fur. "Still on guard, huh, buddy?" Ethan murmured. Ranger looked up at him. Dark eyes, steady. The dog's tail thumped softly once against the floor. Ethan exhaled slowly. Ranger had been at his side longer than anyone else in his life now. Longer than his old job. Longer than the house he had lost. Longer than the friends who had slowly stopped calling. And in many ways, Ranger understood him better than any human ever had. Across the room, a truck stop employee wiped down a counter and glanced briefly in their direction. Not unfriendly, but not welcoming either. Just another tired look people gave when they saw someone who clearly didn't belong. Ethan had gotten used to those looks. Invisible. That's what it felt like most days. Invisible. Until someone needed the bench he was sitting on. Invisible. Until a manager asked him to move along. Invisible. Until the morning shift arrived. He shifted slightly and leaned back against the wall. Ranger lowered his head onto Ethan's boot. Outside, another gust of wind pushed snow against the glass doors. Ethan watched it drift past the windows. He had been here for 4 hours already. The bench was hard, but it was dry, and it was warm for now. His backpack rested beside him. Old canvas. The zipper had started to split at one corner. Everything he owned in the world fit inside that bag. 2 shirts, a pair of socks, a folding knife, and one small leather pouch he had almost forgotten about. Ethan stared at the bag for a long time, before finally pulling it closer. Ranger lifted his head again, watching. "You remember this thing?" Ethan said quietly. He unzipped the outer pocket and reached inside. His fingers brushed against something cold and heavy metal. He slowly pulled it out. A large, old-fashioned brass key. The kind of key that looked like it belonged in another century. It felt heavier than it should have. For a long moment, Ethan just stared at it. 25 years. That was how long he had carried it, or rather how long it had sat forgotten in that leather pouch. The memory came back slowly. A hospital room. The smell of antiseptic. His grandmother Eleanor, lying in bed. Her white hair spread across the pillow. She had called him close that day, pressed the pouch into his hands. "Someday you may need this," she had whispered. He remembered laughing, softly, back then. He had been 22, young, strong, just back from his first tour overseas. He had thought the world was something you could wrestle into submission. "Need what, Grandma?" he had asked. Her eyes had been serious. "The cabin," she said quietly. Ethan blinked slowly now as the memory settled over him. The cabin. He reached back into the pouch and pulled out the folded paper. It was a map, yellowed with age and drawn by hand. It showed a stretch of mountains deep inside the Bitterroot Range, a narrow dirt road, and a small square marking a cabin in the woods. At the bottom of the map was her handwriting. "If the world ever leaves you with nowhere to go, go here." Ethan stared at the map. For years, he had assumed the cabin had probably collapsed or been torn down. No one in the family had talked about it after she died. No one cared. They had sold the house in town, split the money, moved on. The cabin had simply faded into memory until now. Ranger nudged Ethan's hand. The dog's nose brushed against the brass key. Ethan looked down at him. "You think it's still standing, boy?" he said softly. Ranger's ears perked. The dog gave a quiet, low huff, almost like an answer. Ethan looked back toward the snowy darkness outside the glass doors. Somewhere out there, 3 hours north, deep in the mountains, there might still be a cabin waiting, or maybe nothing at all. But sitting here in the cold glow of the truck stop lights, Ethan realized something. He had already run out of options. He scratched Ranger behind the ears. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess we're going to find out." Outside, the wind pushed another sheet of snow across the parking lot. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan Brooks felt something inside him that hadn't been there in a long time. Hope. It was a fragile thing. Quiet and careful, like the small flame of a match in a dark room. He closed his hand slowly around the brass key, feeling its cold edges press into his palm. For years he had carried it without thinking. Just another object buried in a forgotten pouch. Now, it suddenly felt heavier, important. Ranger lifted his head again, watching Ethan. With the calm, steady patience the dog had always shown. Outside, a semi-truck roared to life in the parking lot. The deep rumble vibrated through the building. Ethan flinched. It happened before he could stop it. His shoulders tightened. His breath caught halfway in his chest. His eyes darted toward the door like something dangerous might be rushing inside. For a second, the truck stop disappeared. The fluorescent lights vanished, and he was somewhere else. Heat, dust, the sharp crack of distant gunfire echoing through a valley. Ethan's fingers dug into the edge of the bench. Then something warm pressed against his knee. Ranger. The dog leaned closer, his head gently nudging Ethan's hand. Not frantic, not panicked, just steady, grounded. Ethan blinked hard, and the memory dissolved like smoke. The truck stop returned, the humming lights, the smell of coffee and diesel fuel. His breathing slowly steadied again. "Yeah," he whispered, rubbing Ranger's neck. "I know. I'm here." Ranger's tail thumped once against the tile floor. The dog had learned how to do that years ago. Back when they were both still in uniform. Back when neither of them knew how long the war would follow them home. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. The memories came anyway, not violent, just clear, like old film playing in the back of his mind. 6 years earlier, in southern Afghanistan, a patrol had been moving along a narrow dirt road between dry hills. The air had been so hot that day it shimmered above the ground. Ethan had been walking near the center of the column, sweat soaking through the back of his uniform. Ranger had been working ahead of them on a short lead, alert and focused. German shepherds trained for explosive detection were something special. They didn't just smell danger, they understood it. Ethan still remembered the moment everything changed. Ranger had stopped. He did not bark or panic. He simply froze. Every muscle in the dog's body went rigid. Ethan noticed immediately. "Hold up," he had said quietly. The patrol stopped. Ranger lowered his head toward the dirt, slow and careful, then looked back at Ethan with those same dark, intelligent eyes. Something was wrong. Ethan had barely opened his mouth to warn the others when the world exploded. A deafening blast ripped through the road behind them. Dust and rocks shot into the air. Someone shouted. Another soldier stumbled. But Ethan barely heard any of it, because in the chaos, Ranger had lunged forward. The dog had slammed into Ethan's chest hard. The force knocked him sideways off the road and into a shallow ditch. Half a second later, another buried explosive detonated exactly where Ethan had been standing. The shockwave blasted dirt and smoke across the patrol. For several seconds, everything went silent except for ringing in Ethan's ears. When he finally pushed himself upright, Ranger was lying beside him, whining softly. Blood darkened the dog's front leg. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. "Ranger!" He dropped to his knees beside the dog, his hands shaking as he checked the wound. Shrapnel. Not deep, but enough to hurt. Ranger's ears flattened slightly as Ethan examined the injury. But the dog didn't pull away. He just kept watching Ethan. Steady, trusting. "You saved my life, buddy," Ethan had whispered hoarsely. The memory still sat heavy in his chest. Back in the truck stop, Ethan opened his eyes again. Ranger was watching him. Older. Now, a thin scar ran along the dog's front leg, where the shrapnel had torn through muscle years ago. But Ranger still moved with quiet strength. Still loyal. Still watching Ethan like his only job in the world was to make sure his partner came home safe. Ethan scratched the dog behind the ear. "You remember that day?" he said softly. Ranger tilted his head slightly. Maybe the dog did. Maybe he didn't. But what Ethan knew for certain was this. If Ranger hadn't been there that afternoon in Afghanistan, Ethan Brooks would never have made it home. After they returned to the States, the Army had officially retired Ranger from service. Ethan had signed the paperwork himself. He remembered the officer asking him a simple question. "Are you willing to adopt the dog permanently?" Ethan hadn't even hesitated. "Yes, sir." It was the easiest decision Ethan had ever made. Since then, Ranger had been with him through everything. Through the long nights after Ethan left the Army. Through the first time a backfiring car sent him diving for cover in a grocery store parking lot. Through the slow unraveling of his life after his father died. Through the day the bank notice arrived on the door of his house. Through the moment he packed everything he owned into a backpack. And through every cold night since, Ranger never left. Ethan looked down at the brass key again. The mountains on that map suddenly didn't seem so far away. 3 hours north by road and far longer on foot. A cabin waited in the Bitterroot Range. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had collapsed under snow years ago. But maybe, just maybe, his grandmother had known something he didn't. Ethan folded the map carefully and slipped it back into the pouch. Then he zipped the bag shut. He stood slowly, stretching his stiff legs. "All right," he said quietly. Ranger stood immediately ready, always ready. Ethan slung the backpack over his shoulder and looked once more at the dark windows of the truck stop. It had been shelter for the night, but it wasn't home. He pushed the door open. The cold Montana wind rushed in instantly, sharp and biting. Snowflakes drifted across the empty highway. Ethan stepped outside. Ranger moved beside him without hesitation. Ethan looked north toward the dark outline of the mountains. "Come on, Ranger," he said softly. "Let's go see if that cabin's still out there." Ranger's ears lifted. The dog gave one quiet, determined bark. And together, man and dog started walking into the night. Snow crunched under Ethan Brooks's boots as he and Ranger moved across the edge of the truck stop parking lot and onto the narrow shoulder of the highway. The wind cut across the open land like a blade, pushing dry snow and thin waves across the asphalt. Ethan pulled the collar of his old army jacket higher around his neck. Montana nights could be brutal in winter, especially when you didn't have a place waiting for you. Ranger walked beside him without a leash, his paws silent, despite the ice scattered along the road. Every few seconds, the dog glanced back at Ethan, as if checking that he was still there. That habit had never gone away. Not since the war. Ethan looked toward the dark outline of the mountains in the distance. Even from miles away, he could see the jagged line of the Bitterroot Range rising against the night sky. Somewhere in those mountains sat a cabin he hadn't seen since he was a kid, if it was even still standing. A cold gust of wind whipped through the open highway, and Ethan shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets. The road ahead stretched into darkness, but the hardest part of his journey had already happened months earlier, long before the truck stop, long before the snow. The final collapse had started the day his father died. The memory returned as clearly as if it were happening again. Late spring, a gray sky hanging low over the Bitterroot Valley. Ethan had been standing in the small hospital room in Hamilton, Montana, listening to the steady beep of machines beside his father's bed. The old man had been stubborn his entire life. A ranch mechanic who had spent decades fixing tractors and harvesters for farmers across the valley, he never liked hospitals. But time had caught up to him. Heart failure, the doctors had said. Ethan had been there when the machines finally went quiet. And after that, everything began to fall apart. The house Ethan had grown up in sat on 10 acres of land just outside Hamilton. It wasn't fancy, but it had been in the Brooks family for 3 generations. What Ethan hadn't realized until after the funeral was how much debt his father had been carrying. Medical bills, loans, property taxes that had gone unpaid during the last 2 years of illness. Within weeks, the bank started calling. At first, the callers sounded polite. Then they sounded less polite. Finally, they sounded impatient. Ethan had tried to keep up. He picked up extra work repairing farm equipment, worked long days in dusty barns and muddy fields, but the numbers didn't add up. The debt was too large. One afternoon, a black pickup truck pulled into his driveway. Ethan still remembered the man who stepped out. Tall, expensive coat, perfectly polished boots that had never seen real dirt. Carl Whitmore. Everyone in the valley knew that name. Whitmore was buying land all over western Montana. Ranches, old farms, anything with acreage. The rumor was he wanted to build luxury resorts and private hunting properties for wealthy clients from the cities. Whitmore looked around Ethan's property with a slow smile. "Beautiful land," he said casually. Ethan didn't like the way the man said it, like he already owned it. Whitmore had offered to buy the land that day. Cash. Enough to cover Ethan's debts, but only barely. It was an insult of an offer. Ethan shook his head. "This place isn't for sale." Whitmore had only shrugged. Everything's for sale. Eventually, a month later, the bank sent the foreclosure notice. 7 days. That was all the time Ethan had left. He packed what he could into his old truck. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, watching quietly as Ethan loaded the last box. The dog seemed to sense something was wrong. The night before he had to leave, Ethan walked through the house one last time. The kitchen, where his father had cooked breakfast every morning. The workshop behind the barn, where they had repaired engines together. The living room where Ranger had first arrived after retiring from the army. Ethan paused at the doorway and looked back one last time. He had survived war, survived explosions and gunfire halfway across the world. But losing his home hurt in a completely different way. Ranger walked over and rested his head against Ethan's hand. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. "Guess it's just you and me now," he said quietly. The next morning, he drove away. 2 weeks later, the truck broke down outside Missoula. The repair cost more than Ethan had left. He sold the truck for scrap. Since then, it had been nothing but walking, and cold nights. Back on the highway, Ethan slowed his pace as the wind grew stronger. Ranger suddenly stopped. The dog turned his head toward the dark highway behind them. Ethan followed his gaze. Headlights appeared in the distance, a pickup truck. It approached quickly, tires crunching through snow. Ethan stepped farther off the road, giving the driver space. The truck slowed as it passed. Then the brake lights flared red. The vehicle rolled to a stop about 30 yards ahead. Ethan froze. Ranger's ears lifted. The dog stepped slightly in front of Ethan, protective. The truck door opened, and a man climbed out. He wore a heavy flannel coat, and a wool cap pulled low over his forehead. The man looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he nodded toward Ranger. "Fine-looking shepherd you've got there." Ethan didn't answer right away. Years of instinct made him cautious around strangers. The man raised his hand slightly. "Relax. I'm not looking for trouble." He pointed toward the mountains. "Where are you headed this late?" Ethan hesitated. Then he answered honestly. "North, into the Bitterroots." The man let out a low whistle. "That's a long walk in this weather." Ethan shrugged. "Don't have much choice." The man studied him for another moment. Then he glanced at Ranger again. "Well," he said slowly, "I can at least get you a little closer." He jerked his thumb toward the truck. "I'm headed north on Highway 93. I've got room in the cab if you and your dog want a ride." Ethan looked down at Ranger. The shepherd's tail moved once, not wagging wildly. Just a small, steady motion. Ethan exhaled slowly. Maybe the mountains were not as far away as he had thought. "All right," Ethan said. "Appreciate it." The man nodded. "Name's Tom." Ethan climbed into the extended cab, and Ranger jumped in beside him. The engine started again as the truck pulled back onto the highway. Ethan looked north, toward the dark mountains, growing closer with every mile. Somewhere in those woods, the old cabin waited. Whether it held shelter or nothing at all, Ethan Brooks was finally on his way to find out. The pickup truck roared steadily along Highway 93, its headlights cutting a narrow path through the drifting snow. Ethan sat in the warm extended cab, with his backpack tucked beside him. Ranger lay close at his side. The dog's thick fur pressed against Ethan's leg. Above them, the Montana sky stretched black and endless. Every few miles, the truck passed a lonely farmhouse or a gas station glowing faintly in the distance, but most of the land was empty. Wide valleys, dark forests, and mountains rose like shadows along the horizon. Ethan pulled the collar of his jacket tighter and watched the Bitterroot Range slowly grow larger ahead. The ride remained quiet. Tom, the driver, didn't seem like a talkative man. Every now and then, Tom glanced toward the rearview mirror to make sure Ethan and Ranger were comfortable. But otherwise, he kept his attention on the icy road. Ranger rested his head on Ethan's boot. The dog's breathing was slow and calm. For the first time in weeks, Ethan didn't feel like the ground beneath him was slipping away. But the deeper they drove into the mountains, the more his thoughts returned to the small leather pouch inside his backpack and to the woman who had given it to him. Eleanor Brooks, his grandmother. Ethan had been close to her growing up. She had lived in a small white house in Hamilton with a garden full of roses and wind chimes that sang every time the breeze passed through. She had always been different from the rest of the family. Quiet, observant, as if she noticed things other people overlooked. When Ethan came home from the army after his first tour overseas, Eleanor had been the only person who didn't ask him questions about the war. She simply hugged him and said, "I'm glad you made it home." A year later, she fell ill. The doctors called it a heart condition. Ethan remembered the hospital room clearly. Soft afternoon sunlight pouring through the windows, the quiet hum of machines, and Eleanor lying there in the narrow bed, looking smaller than he had ever seen her. He had been standing beside her when she reached for his hand. "Ethan," she said softly. He leaned closer, so she would not have to strain her voice. "Yes, Grandma?" She nodded toward the wooden drawer beside the hospital bed. "There's something in there for you." Ethan opened the drawer. Inside was the same leather pouch that now sat in his backpack. At the time, it didn't seem important. Just an old pouch tied with a cord. "What is it?" he asked. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment. Her eyes were sharp, even though her body had grown weak. "Insurance," she said quietly. Ethan laughed a little. "Insurance for what?" "For life." Her fingers tightened around his hand. "Someday the world may be harder on you than you expect." Ethan remembered, shaking his head. "I'll be fine." She smiled gently. "That's what strong men always say." Then she pointed to the pouch. "Inside is a key and a map." Ethan had frowned slightly. A map to the cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains. He had heard the family mention the cabin before. Some old property the Brooks family had owned decades ago, but nobody ever talked about it seriously. Most people assumed it had rotted away long ago. "You want me to check on it someday?" Ethan asked. Eleanor slowly shook her head. "No." Her voice became serious. "Listen to me carefully." Ethan leaned closer. "Do not go there out of curiosity." Her eyes held his. "Only go when you truly have nowhere left to turn." Ethan remembered feeling confused. "Why?" Eleanor took a slow breath. "Because some doors should stay closed until the right moment." The room had grown quiet after that. Ethan had slipped the pouch into his jacket pocket. Without thinking much about it, he assumed it was just an old family story, a sentimental gift. But before he left the hospital that day, Eleanor had called his name again. "Ethan." He turned back. "If that day ever comes," she said softly, "trust what you find there." Those were the last words she spoke to him. The memory faded as the truck slowed. Ethan lifted his head. The road had narrowed now. Tall pine trees lined both sides of the highway, their branches heavy with snow. Tom pointed ahead. "Another 20 minutes, he said. "After that, I turn east toward Darby." Ethan nodded. "That's fine." The truck continued climbing through the mountains. Snowflakes swirled in the headlights, like drifting sparks. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears perked forward. Ethan followed his gaze. In the distance, far beyond the highway, the jagged silhouette of the Bitterroot peaks cut across the sky like a wall of black stone. Somewhere beyond those trees, the cabin waited, or what remained of it. Ethan felt the weight of the brass key again in his pocket. 25 years. If the cabin had survived that long, it would be a miracle. The truck slowed again. Tom rolled down his window and pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching off into the forest. That the place you're looking for? Ethan unfolded the map under the dim light of the truck's cab. The hand-drawn lines matched the shape of the road exactly. He nodded slowly. That's it. Tom pulled the truck to a stop. The engine idled quietly in the cold night air. You sure you want to go in there? Tom asked. Ethan glanced at Ranger. The dog was already standing, tail steady, eyes focused toward the dark forest road. Yeah, Ethan said. I'm sure. Tom gave a small nod. Well, good luck to you. Ethan climbed down from the cab. Snow crunched under his boots again. Ranger jumped down beside him. The pickup's headlights illuminated the narrow forest road for a moment, before the truck slowly turned around and drove back toward the highway. The red taillights faded into the darkness. Silence returned. Ethan stood there for a moment, looking into the trees. The road ahead was barely visible beneath the snow. Tall pines loomed on both sides like silent guardians. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key. Even in the darkness, the metal glinted faintly. Ranger stepped forward, sniffing the air. Then the dog looked back at Ethan, waiting. Ethan slipped the key back into his pocket. Well, Ranger, he murmured quietly. Looks like this is it. The wind rustled through the pine branches overhead, and somewhere deep in the forest, something old waited in the dark. The narrow logging road disappeared beneath a blanket of snow that glowed faintly under the moonlight. Ethan Brooks stood at the edge of the forest for a moment, listening. The highway noise was already fading behind him. All that remained was the wind whispering through tall pine branches and the quiet creak of trees shifting in the cold. Ranger stepped forward first. The German shepherd lowered his nose to the ground, sniffed once, then looked back at Ethan, as if asking permission. Ethan gave a small nod. Go ahead, partner. Ranger moved down the road, his dark shape weaving between patches of moonlight and shadow. Ethan followed, boots crunching softly through the frozen snow. The forest swallowed them quickly. Within minutes, the highway was gone completely, hidden behind the dense wall of trees. The world narrowed to a thin white path, winding deeper into the Bitterroot Mountains. Ethan pulled the folded map from his pocket and studied it under the pale glow of the moon. According to Eleanor's hand-drawn lines, the cabin sat somewhere at the end of this road. 2 miles, maybe 3. Hard to tell exactly, but the road was still there. That was a good sign. He slipped the map back into his pocket and kept walking. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Every breath stung slightly as it filled his lungs. Snow clung to the branches above, occasionally falling in soft bursts whenever the wind shook the trees. Ranger moved confidently ahead, his ears alert. The dog paused now and then, sniffing the air, or glancing into the dark woods on either side of the road. Ethan trusted those instincts. Ranger had spent years detecting danger long before any human could notice it. They walked for nearly an hour. The climb slowly grew steeper. Ethan's legs burned from the effort, and the old ache in his knee, left over from an injury overseas, began to throb with every step. Still, he kept moving. Somewhere ahead, a place from his childhood waited, or at least the memory of it. Ethan remembered visiting the cabin once when he was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. His father had driven him up into the mountains in an old pickup truck, bouncing along rough dirt roads until the forest suddenly opened into a small clearing. The cabin had stood there then, quiet, simple, built from dark logs with a stone chimney rising along one side. His father had only stayed a few hours, checking the roof and clearing fallen branches from the porch. Your great-grandfather built this place, he had told Ethan. Why don't we live here? Ethan had asked. His father had shrugged. Too far from town. Hard to maintain. Your grandmother keeps the paperwork, but nobody really uses it anymore. After that day, Ethan had never seen the cabin again. The memory felt distant now, almost like something from another life. Ranger suddenly stopped. The dog stood still in the middle of the road, ears pointed forward. Ethan slowed. "What is it?" Ranger didn't bark. He simply stared ahead. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. At first, he saw nothing but trees. Then, the forest shifted slightly. The road curved around a small rise, and beyond it, the trees opened just enough for a clearing to appear through the darkness. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. They walked the last few yards slowly. When they reached the top of the rise, the clearing spread out before them like a hidden pocket inside the mountains. And there it was, the cabin. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. The structure stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by tall pines, whose branches hung low with snow. It was larger than he remembered. 2 stories tall, built from thick, dark logs that had weathered decades of storms. But what caught Ethan's attention wasn't the cabin itself. It was the way the building had been sealed. Every window was covered with heavy wooden boards, carefully nailed into place. The front door was wrapped with thick iron chains, looped across the handle, and locked with 3 heavy padlocks. Snow had gathered along the porch steps, untouched. No footprints, no tire tracks. Nothing. The place looked less abandoned than deliberately protected. Ethan walked slowly toward the porch. Ranger followed close beside him. The boards across the windows were old, but they had been placed carefully, not thrown up in a hurry, but secured with purpose, almost like someone had wanted to make absolutely certain nobody could get inside. Ethan climbed the porch steps cautiously. The wood creaked under his boots, but it held firm. Ranger sniffed along the edge of the porch, then sat beside the door, watching quietly. Ethan stared at the chains wrapped around the door handle. 3 locks, all rusted with age. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the brass key. For a moment, he just held it. The metal felt cold against his fingers. He remembered Eleanor's voice again. "Only go when you truly have nowhere left to turn." Ethan looked around the clearing. The mountains rose dark and silent around them. No lights, no neighbors for miles, just the wind and the forest. He let out a slow breath. "Well, Grandma," he murmured softly, "looks like that time finally came." He knelt down and lifted the first padlock. The brass key slid into the keyhole. For a second, nothing happened. Then, Ethan turned the key. A dull metallic click echoed across the quiet clearing. The first lock opened. Ranger stood up immediately, tail stiff. Ethan moved to the second lock. The key slid in again. Another turn. Another click. The second chain loosened and dropped slightly against the door. Only 1 lock remained. Ethan hesitated. His heart was beating harder now. Behind that door could be anything. An empty ruin, rotten floors, a collapsed roof, or maybe something Eleanor had protected all these years. Ranger gave a low, quiet whine beside him. Ethan glanced down at the dog. "You ready, partner?" Ranger's tail moved slowly. Ethan lifted the final padlock. The rusted metal groaned as he forced the key into place. He twisted. For a moment, the lock refused to move. Then, with a harsh grinding sound, it finally turned. The last chain fell loose. The cabin door stood silent in front of him, waiting. Ethan wrapped his hand around the old iron handle. Behind him, the forest stood completely still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ranger leaned slightly forward, muscles tense. Ethan slowly pushed the door open. The hinges groaned loudly in the quiet night. Cold air rushed out from inside the dark cabin. Ethan lifted his flashlight and shone it through the doorway. Both man and dog froze. The cabin looked nothing like the abandoned ruin Ethan had expected. It looked preserved. Ethan Brooks stood in the doorway with the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam cut through the darkness and drifted slowly across the cabin's interior. Dust floated lazily in the air like tiny snowflakes, but nothing was broken. Nothing had collapsed. The furniture stood exactly where it should be. A wooden table rested in the center of the room, with 4 chairs tucked neatly around it. A cast-iron stove sat against the far wall. Shelves lined the kitchen area, and several jars still stood on them, their glass surfaces dulled by time. White sheets covered the couch and 2 armchairs, protecting them from dust. It looked less like an abandoned building and more like a house someone had closed carefully, planning to come back someday. Ranger stepped cautiously across the threshold. The dog's claws clicked softly against the wooden floor as he sniffed the air. Ethan followed slowly behind. The smell inside the cabin was old, but not rotten. Dry wood, dust, a faint hint of pine. He swung the flashlight beam across the walls. Everything looked intact. The wooden beams above were straight and strong. The stone fireplace stood solid in the corner. Even the old rug beneath the table still held its shape. Ethan let out a slow breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Well, I'll be," he murmured quietly. Ranger walked deeper into the room, nose low to the floor, investigating every corner. His tail moved slowly, steady, and calm. Ethan closed the cabin door behind them to keep the wind out. The heavy wood thumped softly as it shut. For the first time in weeks, the sound of silence surrounded him. Real silence. Not the humming lights of a truck stop. Not the distant roar of traffic. Just the quiet creak of old wood and the wind brushing softly against the cabin walls. Ethan stepped farther inside. He lifted one of the white sheets from the couch. The fabric puffed slightly as it moved, releasing a cloud of dust. Underneath, the couch looked worn but sturdy. The cushions had faded patterns stitched into them, the kind people used in the 70s. He ran his hand across the armrest. Still solid, still usable. "Grandma, what did you do out here?" he whispered. Ranger wandered toward the kitchen area and sniffed along the floorboards. Ethan moved to the window and pried one of the wooden boards loose, just enough to peek outside. Moonlight spilled into the cabin in a thin silver line. He turned back toward the room. The place didn't look abandoned at all. It looked protected, preserved, almost like someone had sealed it intentionally. Ethan walked over to the cast-iron stove and opened the small metal door. Inside, dry ashes rested from the last fire that had burned there. He closed the stove again and shook his head slowly. "This place could still work," he muttered. He set his backpack down beside the table. Ranger came over immediately and sat beside it as if guarding their only belongings. Ethan gave the dog a tired smile. "Yeah, I know. Don't trust it yet." He pulled a small battery lantern from his pack and placed it on the table. The warm glow filled the room with soft yellow light, pushing the darkness back into the corners. The cabin suddenly felt more welcoming, more human. Ethan took off his jacket and draped it over one of the chairs. His muscles ached from the long walk through the mountains. The cold had settled deep into his bones. But here, inside these walls, the wind couldn't reach him. Ranger circled twice on the rug near the fireplace before lying down with a soft grunt. Ethan crouched beside the hearth and searched the wood box beside it. To his surprise, several dry logs still rested inside. Someone had stacked them neatly. Years ago, maybe decades. Ethan shook his head again in disbelief. "Well, Let's see if this old place still remembers how to keep a man warm. He gathered a few pieces of kindling and struck a match. The flame flickered brightly in the quiet room. Within minutes, the fire began to grow inside the stone fireplace. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin. Orange light danced across the walls. Ranger lifted his head and watched the flames for a moment before relaxing again. Ethan sat back against the couch and stretched his legs toward the fire. For the first time in weeks, the tight knot in his chest loosened slightly. The silence inside the cabin felt different from the silence outside. Safer, protected. But the night wasn't finished with him yet. Ethan leaned his head back against the couch. His eyes drifted closed for just a moment. And suddenly, a loud crack echoed in his mind. Gunfire, shouting, the thunder of an explosion. Ethan jerked upright with a gasp. His heart slammed against his ribs as if trying to escape his chest. For a second, he couldn't breathe. The cabin vanished. The fire disappeared. He was back in the desert again. Smoke, dust, chaos. His hands trembled. Then something warm pressed against his arm. Ranger. The dog stood beside him now, his nose pushing gently into Ethan's shoulder. Ethan blinked hard. Oh! The cabin returned. The firelight flickered across the stone walls. Ranger stared at him with calm, steady eyes. Yeah, Ethan whispered hoarsely. I'm here. He reached down and rested his hand on the dog's neck. Slowly, his breathing returned to normal. The episode passed, like it always did, but Ranger never moved away. The dog stayed there beside him, quiet and patient. After a while, Ethan stood up and walked slowly around the cabin. There were 2 doors along the back wall. One led to a narrow staircase that climbed toward the second floor. The other led to a small hallway. He opened the hallway door. Inside were 2 rooms. One looked like a bedroom, the other a storage pantry. Both were sealed under dust-covered sheets, just like the living room. Ethan returned to the main room and stared thoughtfully at the fireplace. The stonework looked thicker than usual, stronger, almost like it had been built with more than just decoration in mind. He shrugged slightly. Old cabins were built strangely. Sometimes. Still, something about the place felt unusual. Ranger suddenly stood up again. The dog walked slowly across the floor toward the stone fireplace. His nose moved along the wooden boards near the hearth. Then he stopped. Ranger tilted his head slightly. He sniffed again, and then the German Shepherd began scratching at the floor. The sharp scrape of Ranger's claws against the wooden boards echoed through the quiet cabin. Ethan turned from the fireplace. What is it, boy? Ranger didn't look back. He kept scratching at the same spot beside the stone hearth. His nose pressed low against the floorboards. The dog let out a short bark, then pawed the wood again with growing insistence. Ethan walked over slowly. The fire crackled softly behind him, sending warm light across the room. Ranger stepped aside just enough for Ethan to see the spot he had been digging at. It looked like ordinary floorboards, old wood, worn smooth with time. Ethan crouched down and ran his hand across the boards. Nothing unusual. No gaps. No loose planks. He tapped the wood once with his knuckles. Solid. Ranger gave another small bark and scratched again, this time harder. Easy, Ethan murmured. The dog froze immediately, though his eyes remained fixed on the floor. Ethan studied the area again. It was right beside the fireplace, close enough that the stone foundation beneath the cabin might run under that section of floor. Maybe Ranger smelled an animal under the house, a squirrel or a raccoon looking for warmth. That would make sense. Still, Ranger had never been the kind of dog who barked without reason. Ethan leaned closer and sniffed the air himself. All he smelled was dust and old wood. "No critter holes," he said quietly. Ranger tilted his head, clearly unconvinced. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. "Maybe tomorrow we take a better look, huh?" Ranger stared at the floor for another moment. Then, reluctantly, he stepped back. Ethan stood up and stretched his tired back. "Right now, I think we both need sleep more than mysteries." Ranger huffed softly, as if disagreeing. But he followed Ethan across the room anyway. The fire had grown stronger in the hearth, filling the cabin with steady warmth. Outside, the wind brushed through the pine trees. But inside the walls, the sound was distant and gentle. Ethan spread one of the dust sheets over the couch cushions to create a makeshift blanket. It wasn't much, but compared to the freezing truck stop benches he had slept on the past few weeks, it felt like a luxury. He sat down heavily. The exhaustion hit him all at once. Ranger circled twice on the rug before settling down beside the couch, close enough that his fur brushed Ethan's boot. The firelight flickered across the ceiling beams. Ethan stared at the flames for a long time. The warmth slowly soaked into his bones. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing steadied. For the first time in days, the tight weight pressing on his chest began to lift. "This might actually work," he murmured. Ranger thumped his tail once against the floor. Ethan leaned his head back against the couch. The crackle of burning wood filled the cabin with a soft rhythm. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually, his eyes drifted closed. Sleep came quickly, but peace did not last long. Somewhere in the darkness of his mind, the war waited. The desert heat returned. Blinding sunlight, the sharp smell of dust and burning metal, voices shouting in the distance. Ethan ran across broken ground with his rifle raised, the sound of helicopters roaring above him. Then the explosion. The ground shook. Fire erupted in front of him. Someone screamed. Ethan dropped to the dirt as debris rained down. His heart pounded violently in his chest. He looked around wildly for his team. Smoke filled the air. The world spun. And then a loud bark shattered the memory. Ethan jerked awake. His chest heaved as he sucked in air. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. His eyes darted around the dark room. The fire still burned in the hearth. The wooden beams overhead replaced the desert sky. And Ranger stood beside him. The German shepherd had placed both paws against the couch, his nose pressing firmly against Ethan's shoulder. "Easy, easy," Ethan whispered hoarsely. Ranger whined softly. Ethan reached out and gripped the dog's thick fur. "I'm all right." The dog didn't move until Ethan's breathing slowed. Finally, Ranger relaxed and lowered himself back onto the rug. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. His heart was still racing. The nightmares had followed him home from the war years ago. They always found him eventually. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't waking up in a cramped apartment or the backseat of a car or a freezing bus station. He was waking up in a cabin deep in the Montana mountains, and Ranger was still beside him. Ethan let out a long breath. Guess we made it somewhere after all. The fire burned low. Outside the cabin, snow began falling again. Soft flakes drifted through the silent forest, covering the clearing in a fresh white blanket. Inside, the warmth held steady. Ethan eventually closed his eyes again. This time, sleep came slower, but it came. Hours later, pale morning light crept through the narrow cracks between the boards, covering the windows. The cabin, filled with thin lines of gold. Ranger was already awake. The German shepherd lifted his head and sniffed the air. Then he stood. The dog walked quietly across the cabin floor, toward the fireplace again. The same spot, the same boards. He lowered his nose, sniffed once, then twice. And this time, Ranger began digging harder. The sharp scrape of his claws echoed across the quiet cabin. Ethan stirred on the couch, blinking slowly as the pale morning light crept through the cracks in the boarded windows. For a moment, he lay still, listening. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He pushed himself up on one elbow. Ranger? The dog didn't stop. Ranger was crouched beside the stone fireplace again, his nose pressed against the wooden floorboards, his claws raking at the same spot with determined focus. "Hey," Ethan muttered, his voice rough from sleep. He swung his legs off the couch and stood. "What's got you so worked up this early?" Ranger barked once, short and sharp, without looking back. Ethan walked across the room, rubbing his eyes. The fire had burned down to glowing embers during the night. The cabin felt cooler now, though the stone walls still held some of the warmth from yesterday. Ranger stepped aside the moment Ethan approached, but he didn't move far. He stood close, staring intensely at the floor. Ethan crouched down. The wooden boards showed faint claw marks now. Small grooves scratched into the surface where Ranger had been digging. "All right," Ethan murmured. "Let's see what's got your attention." He pressed his palm against the boards. They felt slightly warmer than the rest of the floor, maybe because they sat close to the fireplace. But something else caught his eye. A thin edge, almost invisible, a line running along the grain of the wood. Ethan leaned closer. It wasn't just a floorboard seam. It was a perfect square. Ranger gave a quiet whine. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge again. The wood shifted slightly. Under pressure. "Well, I'll be." He stood and scanned the room. There had to be something to pry it open. After a moment, he grabbed the metal poker leaning beside the fireplace. He slid the flat end into the thin seam between the boards. Carefully, slowly, he pushed down. At first, nothing happened. Then, the wood lifted slightly with a dull creak. Dust puffed up from the edges. Ethan pushed harder. The square section of floor rose just enough for him to grip it. He set the poker aside and lifted the panel fully. The wooden hatch swung upward. Beneath it, darkness. A square opening dropped straight down into the earth below the cabin. Cool air drifted up from the hole, carrying the faint smell of concrete and old metal. Ethan froze. Ranger immediately stepped closer, peering into the opening. "What in the world?" Ethan whispered. He grabbed the lantern from the table and held it over the hole. The light revealed a steep metal stairway descending several feet into a small underground chamber. The walls weren't dirt. They were reinforced concrete. A bunker? Ethan stared in disbelief. "Grandma, what did you build out here?" Ranger barked excitedly and placed his front paws on the edge of the hatch, staring into the opening. "Hold on," Ethan said quickly. He lowered the lantern. Ranger tested the first step, then descended carefully. Ethan followed with one hand on the rail. The steps were cold but solid, and after a few seconds, his boots touched concrete. He lifted the lantern. The light spread across the underground chamber. The bunker was larger than he expected. Concrete walls, metal shelves, wooden crates stacked neatly along one side. A steel table stood against the far wall. It looked less like a survival shelter and more like a storage vault. Ranger trotted around the room, sniffing everything. His nails clicked against the concrete floor. Ethan walked slowly through the bunker. His pulse quickened. Somebody had spent serious time and money building this place. The concrete was thick. The shelves were heavy-duty steel. Nothing here looked temporary. He approached the nearest wooden crate. Dust covered the lid. Ethan brushed it away and pried the top open. Inside were thick folders sealed in plastic. He pulled one out and flipped it open. Documents, legal papers, land deeds. Ethan's eyes widened as he read the names printed across the pages. Brooks family holdings, property boundaries, survey maps, and hundreds of acres marked across the Bitterroot Valley. "What?" Ethan whispered. Ranger suddenly barked sharply. Ethan turned. The dog stood beside one of the metal shelving units, tail stiff. Before Ethan could react, the shelf shifted. Years of rust and loose bolts finally gave way. The heavy structure tipped forward. "Ranger! Raw! Ranger!" The metal rack crashed toward them. Ethan dove forward instinctively, but Ranger moved faster. The German shepherd lunged into Ethan's chest, knocking him backward. The shelf slammed into the concrete floor with a deafening crash. Wooden crates exploded open. Papers scattered everywhere. For a moment, the bunker filled with dust and echoes. Ethan coughed, blinking hard. Then he looked down. Ranger lay beside him. The dog tried to stand, but immediately limped. "Easy. Easy." Ethan knelt beside him. "Let me see." Ranger's front leg trembled slightly. Ethan ran his hands carefully along the limb. No broken bone, no major bleeding, but the paw was swelling fast, probably bruised or twisted when the shelf fell. "You stupid brave dog," Ethan whispered softly. Ranger wagged his tail once despite the pain. Ethan grabbed a strip of cloth from his pack and wrapped the paw carefully. "There," he murmured. "That'll hold for now." Ranger licked Ethan's hand. The lantern flickered slightly as the dust settled. Ethan looked around the bunker again. Papers covered the floor. Now, maps, documents, and something else. A large steel safe stood against the far wall. Ethan slowly rose to his feet. Ranger limped beside him. They approached the safe together. Ethan wiped the dust from its surface. The metal door held a combination lock, but taped to the front was an envelope bearing a name in careful handwriting. Ethan Brooks. His breath caught in his throat. He slowly reached out and picked up the envelope. It felt thick, important. Above him, the quiet cabin stood over the bunker. And suddenly, Ethan realized his grandmother had known he would come here someday. The lantern light trembled slightly in Ethan's hand as he stared at the envelope he had taken from the steel safe. His name written in Eleanor Brooks's careful handwriting, not printed, not typed. Written by hand, the same handwriting he remembered from birthday cards and the old recipes she used to leave on the kitchen counter when he was a boy. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. The bunker felt suddenly very quiet. Ranger sat beside him, favoring his injured paw, but watching calmly, as if he understood that something important was about to happen. Ethan slowly peeled the envelope away from the safe. The tape cracked softly as it came loose. His hands were rough and steady from years of work and military training, but now they trembled slightly. He turned the envelope over. It had been sealed decades ago. Ethan carefully tore it open. Inside was a folded letter, thick paper, yellowed slightly with age. He unfolded it slowly. The lantern light illuminated the familiar handwriting, and Eleanor's voice seemed to echo in his mind as he began to read. "Ethan, if you are standing in this room, then life has taken a harder road than I hoped it would for you." Ethan swallowed. Ranger shifted beside him, resting against his leg. Ethan continued reading. "I sealed this cabin many years ago because I knew the world was changing. Land here in the Bitterroot Valley would someday become valuable, too tempting for dishonest people if they learned what our family still held." Ethan's eyes moved across the page, each line pulling him deeper into the truth Eleanor had hidden for decades. Our family once owned much more land than you were told, hundreds of acres across these mountains and valleys. Your great-grandfather built this cabin when the valley was still wild and quiet. Ethan slowly turned one of the scattered maps lying on the floor beside him. The property lines stretched far beyond the clearing outside the cabin. Forests, streams, and large sections of valley land that developers would pay fortunes to control. The letter continued. Over time, I moved most of those holdings into a trust. Quietly and carefully. I let the cabin appear abandoned, so no one would suspect what remained here. Ethan felt a chill run through him. He thought about the boarded windows, the heavy chains on the door, the way the place had been sealed, not abandoned, hidden. He kept reading. If you have opened this safe, it means the trust now belongs to you. The documents in this room prove that the Brooks family still owns these lands across the valley. Ethan's breath caught. Still owns, he whispered. He looked down at the papers scattered across the bunker floor. Land deeds, ownership records, investment statements. His eyes scanned the numbers printed on several of the documents, the value estimates. The figures made his head spin. Millions, possibly more. He leaned back slightly against the concrete wall. All this time, he whispered. Ranger nudged his arm gently. Ethan looked down at the dog. You found it, he said quietly. Ranger wagged his tail once. Ethan returned his attention to the letter. There is something else you must understand, Eleanor had written. There will always be people who want what this land holds. Some will try to take it legally. Others may try less honest methods. Ethan thought immediately of Carl Whitmore, the developer who had tried to buy his old house for a fraction of its value. The man who had been quietly buying land all across the valley. Ethan's jaw tightened. The letter continued. I never told the rest of the family because I knew it would only cause trouble. But I trusted you, Ethan. You always had a good heart. Even when life became difficult. Ethan's throat tightened slightly. The lantern flickered as he turned the page. The valley needs someone who understands sacrifice. Someone who knows what it means to protect others. Ethan sat silently for a moment. War had taken many things from him. Sleep, peace, friends he would never see again. But Eleanor had believed something else remained inside him. Something worth trusting. The last lines of the letter were written in a slightly shakier hand. Use this land wisely. Help people who need it. And remember that real wealth is not money or property. It is the good you leave behind. Love, Grandma Eleanor. Ethan folded the paper slowly. The bunker felt heavier now, full of meaning, full of responsibility. He looked at the steel safe again. If Eleanor had left the letter outside, what was inside the safe itself? Ethan brushed dust from the safe door. The combination dial gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Ranger sniffed the metal curiously. Ethan studied the dial. Then he noticed something scratched lightly into the side of the safe. A short sequence had been scratched into the paint. 6/19/37. Ethan frowned, then remembered Eleanor's birthday, June 19th, 1937. He slowly turned the dial to 6, then 19, then 37. The lock clicked. The sound echoed quietly through the bunker. Ethan opened the safe. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of documents, certificates, more deeds, and a thick folder labeled Brooks Valley Trust. Ethan lifted it carefully. Ranger rested beside him as he flipped through the pages. Everything was official, legal, registered. The Brooks family still owned land stretching across the valley. Land Carl Whitmore had been trying to buy piece by piece. Ethan slowly closed the folder. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel powerless. Then, the silence in the bunker suddenly broke. Ranger's ears snapped upright. The dog turned toward the stairway leading back to the cabin. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Ethan looked up. Ranger. The dog limped toward the stairway, listening to the sounds above them. Something moved inside the cabin. The faint sound of boots shifting across wooden floorboards drifted down through the open hatch. Ethan froze. Ranger's growl deepened, low and warning, vibrating through the quiet bunker. The German shepherd limped toward the stairway, every muscle in his body tense, despite the injured paw. Ethan grabbed the lantern and quickly closed the steel safe. The click of the door shutting sounded loud in the underground chamber. He lowered his voice. Easy, Ranger. But the dog's ears were locked on the ceiling. Someone was definitely inside the cabin. Ethan's mind raced. Nobody knew about this place. He had only arrived yesterday. No neighbors, no nearby roads. Which meant only one thing. Someone had been watching the valley, watching the land, and had followed him here. The boards above creaked again. A heavy step. Then another. Ranger barked once, sharp and angry. Quiet, Ethan whispered. But it was too late. The footsteps above suddenly stopped. Silence filled the cabin overhead. Ethan moved quickly. He slid the hatch halfway closed, but left enough space to see through. Then he climbed the stairway slowly, lantern held low, so the light wouldn't give away his position. Ranger stayed right behind him. Each step upward felt longer than the last. Ethan reached the top step. He paused, listening. The cabin was silent, but the smell of cold air drifted down through the open doorway. The front door must be open. Ethan pushed the hatch open slowly and stepped back into the cabin. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows, painting thin stripes across the floor. The fire in the hearth had nearly died. But that wasn't what Ethan noticed first. The front door stood wide open. Snow had blown inside across the porch boards. Ethan straightened slowly. "Hello," he called. No answer. Ranger limped forward a few steps and sniffed the air. Then the dog suddenly growled again. Ethan turned. A man stepped out from the shadow near the window. Tall, wearing an expensive coat, leather gloves, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Carl Whitmore. Ethan recognized him immediately. The land developer from Hamilton. The same man who had offered to buy Ethan's small house months ago. The same man who had tried to pressure him into selling before the bank foreclosure. Whitmore glanced around the cabin with casual interest. "Well," he said calmly, "looks like you finally found it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You followed me." Whitmore shrugged. "Let's just say I've been paying attention to this valley for a long time." Ranger stepped in front of Ethan, teeth slightly bared. Whitmore glanced at the dog and chuckled. That animal again. His eyes returned to Ethan. "I had a feeling you might come here someday." Ethan crossed his arms. "You knew about the cabin?" Whitmore nodded slowly. "Of course." He walked across the room, running a gloved hand along the wooden table. The Brooks family owned quite a bit of land around here once. He smiled slightly. But most people assumed it had all been sold off decades ago. Ethan stayed silent. Whitmore's eyes drifted toward the open hatch in the floor. The bunker. His smile widened. "So, the rumors were true." Ranger growled louder. Whitmore stopped walking. "Relax," he said casually. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Ethan didn't believe him. Whitmore slipped a folded document from inside his coat. "I came to make you an offer." He held the paper out. A generous one. Ethan didn't move. "What kind of offer?" Whitmore chuckled. "The kind that solves all your problems." He tossed the paper onto the table. Ethan glanced down. A purchase agreement. Whitmore Development Corporation. Offer amount $200,000 for all landholdings, currently registered, under the Brooks Family Trust. Ethan looked back up. That land is worth millions. Whitmore shrugged. Maybe someday. He leaned casually against the table. But right now, you're a homeless veteran, living in a boarded-up cabin. His voice remained calm. $200,000 would change your life, Ranger barked sharply. Whitmore frowned. That dog really doesn't like me. Ethan stepped closer. You should leave. Whitmore sighed. I was hoping we could do this the easy way. He tapped the paper. Sign it. I wire the money tomorrow. You walk away rich. Ethan folded the document once, then placed it back on the table. No. Whitmore's eyes hardened slightly. You sure about that? Ethan nodded. I know what this land is worth now. Whitmore studied him carefully. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Whitmore's smile returned. Interesting. He straightened his coat. Looks like Eleanor told you everything. Ethan's chest tightened. You knew my grandmother? Whitmore chuckled. Everyone in this valley knew Eleanor Brooks. He glanced around the cabin again. She was smarter than people realized. Whitmore walked toward the door, but before leaving, he turned back once more. You'll hear from me again, Mr. Brooks. His smile was thin. And next time, I may not be the only one interested in what's hidden here. The door slammed behind him. Cold wind swept through the cabin. Snowflakes drifted across the wooden floor. Ethan stood there silently. Ranger slowly relaxed, though the dog's ears stayed alert. Ethan walked to the doorway and looked out across the clearing. Whitmore's black SUV sat near the tree line. A moment later, it started and rolled down the narrow logging road, disappearing into the forest. Ethan closed the door. The cabin felt different now, heavier, more dangerous. Ranger limped back to his side. Ethan knelt and rubbed the dog's neck gently. Well, he said quietly, looks like this valley isn't as forgotten as we thought. Ranger wagged his tail slowly. Ethan looked toward the hatch, leading back to the bunker, toward the safe, toward the documents, proving that the land now belonged to him. Whitmore had offered money, but Ethan understood something now. This place wasn't just land. It was a legacy. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Brooks had something worth protecting. Ranger limped slowly across the room and settled beside the fireplace again. The dog lowered himself carefully, favoring the injured paw, but his eyes remained alert. Ethan crouched beside him. Let me check that leg again. Ranger stayed still as Ethan gently unwound the cloth bandage. The swelling had grown slightly, but the paw still held steady when the dog shifted his weight. Bruised, Ethan murmured, but you'll be all right. Ranger licked Ethan's hand once. Ethan gave a faint smile. You saved me again, partner. The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor. Ethan stood and walked slowly toward the window. He pried one of the boards aside, just enough to see the clearing. Snow drifted quietly through the tall pine trees. The valley stretched beyond the forest, hidden beneath layers of winter fog. Somewhere out there were hundreds of acres that legally belonged to him now, and people like Carl Whitmore wanted them. Ethan leaned his forehead briefly against the cold glass. He had spent years believing he had lost everything. His home, his job, his place in the world. But the truth had been buried beneath his feet the entire time, hidden by the one person who had believed in him more than anyone else. Grandma Eleanor. Ethan turned away from the window and walked back to the hatch in the floor. The bunker waited below, full of documents, full of answers. He climbed down the stairway again and picked up the thick folder labeled Brooks Valley Trust. The papers inside detailed every acre of land stretching across the valley. Property lines, survey maps, legal registrations, investment accounts that had quietly grown over decades. Ethan shook his head slowly, all this time. He closed the folder and climbed back into the cabin. Ranger watched him carefully. Ethan sat down at the wooden table and spread several maps across its surface. The lantern light illuminated the valley like a puzzle. Streams cut through the forests. Old logging trails wound across the mountains. Large open sections of land spread along the valley floor. If Whitmore controlled this land, he could build resorts, vacation homes, roads, hotels. The quiet wilderness would disappear. Ethan imagined bulldozers tearing through the trees, concrete replacing the meadows, tourists flooding into the mountains that had once been wild and peaceful. The thought made his stomach twist. Ranger lifted his head and watched Ethan carefully. Ethan reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You know what your nose found down there?" Ranger wagged his tail. "A second chance." The dog rested his head against Ethan's knee. Ethan stared down at the maps again. His mind drifted back to the men he had served beside overseas. Some had never made it home. Others had returned with wounds that no doctor could fully heal. He thought about the nights he had spent sitting awake, unable to quiet the noise in his own mind. The same struggle thousands of veterans faced every day. Suddenly, Eleanor's words from the letter echoed in his thoughts. "Use this land wisely. Help people who need it." Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. The idea formed quietly, but once it appeared, it refused to leave. This valley could become something else. Something better than vacation resorts. Something that actually mattered. Ranger's ears perked slightly as Ethan spoke aloud. "What if this place stayed quiet?" The dog tilted his head. "What if the valley stayed the way it is, but helped people instead?" Ethan stood and walked toward the window again. He imagined cabins scattered through the trees, small homes, quiet spaces where veterans like him could breathe again, places where no one would judge them for waking in the middle of the night, places where the forest and the mountains could help them heal. Ethan smiled faintly. "That's what you meant, Grandma." Ranger barked once softly. Outside, the clouds began to part slightly, revealing a strip of blue sky above the valley. The snow continued falling, but lighter now. Ethan looked down at the maps one last time. Carl Whitmore would come back. He was certain of that. Men like Whitmore didn't walk away from land this valuable. But this time, Ethan wasn't the man he had been a month ago. He wasn't a homeless veteran sleeping in truck stops anymore. He was the legal owner of the Bitterroot Valley property, and he had a purpose. Ethan walked over and closed the hatch to the bunker again. The safe beneath the cabin floor remained secure. The documents were protected. He added another log to the fireplace. Flames climbed higher, filling the room with warmth. Ranger stretched beside the fire and finally rested his head on his paws. Ethan sat down across from him. The two of them watched the flames quietly. Outside, the mountains stood silent and vast. Inside the cabin, the future slowly began to take shape, and Ethan Brooks knew one thing for certain. No amount of money could buy what this valley truly meant. Not anymore. Within days, Ethan carried copies of the deeds and trust papers to a veteran's legal aid office in Hamilton. An attorney named Mara Keene spent 2 long afternoons tracing every filing, tax record, and survey map. The conclusion was clear. Eleanor's trust was valid. The property taxes had been paid from a protected account, and the land belonged to Ethan. When Whitmore's company challenged the claim, Mara answered with certified records and a formal notice barring unauthorized entry. The challenge collapsed before it reached a courtroom. Ethan then placed the most vulnerable acreage under a conservation agreement and created a non-profit foundation for veterans in recovery. A regional veterans organization helped secure permits, donated lumber, and volunteer crews. The decision did not make the work easy, but it made the purpose real. 1 year later, the fire crackled steadily in the stone hearth as Ethan Brooks sat quietly inside the cabin. Outside, the snowstorm that had covered the mountains the night before was beginning to fade. The sky over the Bitterroot Valley slowly turned pale blue, and sunlight spilled across the frozen clearing in front of the cabin. Ranger lifted his head and watched the morning light spread across the restored windows. Ethan stood and walked to the door. He opened it slowly. Cold mountain air rushed into the cabin, carrying the scent of pine and fresh snow. The clearing stretched before him, quiet and untouched. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood there. A year earlier, he had been sleeping in truck stops and wondering where his life had gone wrong. Now he stood at the doorway of a place his family had protected for generations, and the responsibility was his. Ranger walked to his side and sat beside him on the porch. The German shepherd's injured paw had healed, though a faint scar remained between the pads. Ethan rubbed the dog's neck. "You did good, partner." Ranger wagged his tail slowly. The valley below the mountains had begun to wake up. In the distance, several small cabins now stood among the trees, where empty forest had once been. Simple buildings, wooden roofs, smoke rising gently from their chimneys. None of them were resorts. None of them were luxury vacation homes. They were something else entirely. Places for veterans. Places where men and women who had come home from war could breathe again. Places where silence was not frightening, and where no one judged them for waking in the night from memories they could not escape. Ethan stepped down from the porch and walked toward the edge of the clearing. Ranger followed. Below them, the valley stretched wide and peaceful beneath the winter sun. Several men were already working near one of the new cabins, repairing a fence that had fallen under the weight of snow. Another veteran stood near a small greenhouse structure that had been built during the summer. A few others were cutting firewood beside a stacked pile of logs. The work was simple, quiet, but it gave them purpose. And slowly, little by little, the land was healing the people who came there. Ethan leaned against the wooden railing and watched them. He recognized the look in their eyes, the same look he had carried when he first arrived at the cabin. Lost, tired, searching for somewhere to belong again. Ranger sat beside him, calm and proud. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded letter Eleanor had written. The paper had grown softer, with time from being opened and read many times over the past year. He unfolded it carefully. The familiar handwriting still looked the same. Use this land wisely. Help people who need it. Ethan smiled faintly. "I think you'd like what it became," he said quietly. The wind moved gently through the pine trees around the cabin. Far below, laughter drifted up from the valley as two of the veterans joked while hauling lumber across the snow. Ethan folded the letter again and slipped it back into his pocket. The valley had not become a resort. Carl Whitmore had returned several times during the first months, offering larger and larger amounts of money. Each time, Ethan had given the same answer. Eventually, Whitmore stopped coming. The land was no longer an isolated asset that one powerful man could intimidate away. It had become a protected community, a place people were willing to defend together. Ranger stood and walked a few steps ahead into the clearing. The German shepherd paused and looked back at Ethan, tail wagging slowly. Ethan stepped down from the porch and followed. Snow crunched softly under his boots. The mountains stood tall around them, unchanged and watchful. Ethan looked across the valley one last time. He had come here with nothing. No home, no plan, no future. But one loyal dog had refused to give up on him, and one woman had believed in him enough to leave behind a hidden second chance. Ethan knelt beside Ranger and wrapped his arms briefly around the dog's thick fur. "Guess you were the one who found the miracle after all," he murmured. Ranger licked his cheek. Ethan laughed quietly. The two of them turned toward the valley below and began walking down the snowy trail together. The work of protecting the land was only beginning, but Ethan Brooks was no longer alone. And the valley that had once been hidden in silence had become something far more powerful. A place where wounded veterans could find their way home again. If this story touched your heart, I'd like to ask you something simple. Tell us in the comments whether you believe Ranger changed Ethan's life, or whether Eleanor's hidden gift gave both of them the second chance they needed. And if you're watching from somewhere in this big world, tell us where you're watching from. People from all over the world gather here, and it's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already waiting. Somewhere out there, another veteran and another loyal dog are about to discover something no one else believed was possible.